Здравствуйте, welcome to day 107. Today we're reviewing the basics of aspect, right? So this is something that we have to assume you're fairly familiar with after last year, right? A very important topic. Remember that the vast majority of Russian verbs come in aspectual pairs, right? Two infinitives, one imperfective, one perfective. And so essentially whenever you use a verb in Russian, you're choosing between these two things, right? So it's something that's really just inescapable, right? Anytime you hear a verb, you've got to pick up on or use one. You've got to be picking up on this distinction. Otherwise, you're not going to really understand what you're saying or what you're being told, right? So let's think imperfective, right? What are the basic things that an imperfective verb can convey? Well, ongoing action, ongoing or sort of extended action, right? Something that's ongoing across time, right? It can also describe repeated action, right? Repeated action or effort, right? Now, if we could think of effort as a kind of ongoing action, right? Maybe you're trying to get a paper written, you're writing it, so it's kind of this ongoing idea understood in terms of accomplishment, right, or effort, right? You're trying to get it done, right? So we can think more generally of imperfective actions as unbounded, right? They're ongoing, they're not sort of contained, they're ongoing, they're repeating, etc. All right, on the other hand, perfective verbs can describe, they usually describe completed action, right? So not the process, but the completion. It's a one-time thing, right? No repetition. And it can also emphasize success, right? If the imperfective was describing the attempt, right, then the perfective verb is emphasizing the success, right? The accomplishment of the action. Okay, so another way to think about this generally that'll come in handy in a moment is perfective verbs are bound in some way. And again, they usually stress the completion, but they can also in some cases stress the inception, right? Okay, so how can that be? It seems to make maybe no sense. Well, if we think of perfective verbs as sort of like bam, right? This kind of, instantaneous sort of action as opposed to the extended, prolonged action or repeating action of an imperfective verb, right? We get this bam. Well, that bam, depending on the meaning of the given verb, could be thought of as the completion or the beginning of something, right? This kind of instantaneous action. So a nice illustration, you look at the painting, right? Dubras droblenly molniei, right? An oak split by lightning. We could think of that lightning flash as kind of a perfect, right, visualization of a perfective action, right? For example, molnia porazila дерево, lightning struck the tree, right? One time, flash of lightning, right? Perfective verb. But remember that if we were to introduce the idea of repetition, then of course we would have to use imperfective verb, right? So what if the lightning often struck this tree? We would use the imperfective verb поражать, right? Молния часто поражает деревья. Lightning often strikes trees, or lightning would often strike this tree, right? Молния часто поражала дерево. Okay, so those are the basic distinctions. Again, today's lesson, we don't need to rehash every last detail. You can read through the details as necessary. But let's look at a few examples on 29, right? Based on читать, прочитать. Okay, first major distinction, ongoing versus completed action. Она читала «Войну и мир» versus она прочитала «Войну и мир». Okay, a very important difference, right? In the first one, she was reading it. That's all we know, right? She was engaged in the process of reading it. In the second one, right, the perfective verb is emphasizing the completion, the result, right? She completely read it. Or we could think of it as meaning she successfully finished reading it after trying. Okay, again, let's think about tense quickly, right? If we conjugate an imperfective verb, we get present tense, right? But remember that since an action in the present tense is by definition still ongoing, we can't use perfective verbs in the present tense. That means that if we conjugate a perfective verb, the resulting form is automatically future tense. So again, it's a very, very important point that we emphasized last year. So again, compared to examples, Она читает «Войну и мир» means she is reading, that's present tense imperfective. But Она прочитает «Войну и мир», that means she will read War and Peace and she'll read it completely, right? Now, look at how important that is, right? Tense, that's a very important distinction. And there's no way we can know that Она прочитает is future tense if we don't simply know that прочитать is a perfective verb, right? There's no getting around sort of learning verbs as pairs, читать, прочитать, and just knowing the aspect when we see it, right? When we see читать, we know that's imperfective. When we see some form of прочитать, we simply know that that's perfective, just the way a Russian would know. Okay, so one more example, Она читала «Войну и мир». Okay, all that tells us is that she was engaged in the process of reading War and Peace. If we wanted to ask about the completion, right, the result, then we would have to switch to a perfective verb. Она, right, а прочитала, right, did she finish reading it? Да, прочитала, right? Yeah, she, not only was she reading it, she finished reading it. Okay, again, repeated action versus one-time action. Она часто читала «Войну и мир». She would often read War and Peace. That's definitely imperfective. Она почитала «Войну и мир», right? These, we can add по to almost any action verb to create a new perfective verb, meaning doing something for a bit. So that's kind of a special case that we learned last year, right? По means to do something for a bit, right? At least in this, for this special type of perfective. Okay, but then just the normal perfective for читать is прочитать. For example, она прочитала 2 главы сегодня. She got 2 chapters read today, emphasizing a one-time completed act. Okay, and finally, sometimes, depending on context or the meaning of the verb, we can imagine the distinction as being one of effort versus success, right? Она год читала «Войну и мир». Okay, so she was reading this long novel for a year, right? We could think of that as she was trying to get through the novel. And finally, she did. She finished it. She accomplished her goal. Наконец, она прочитала «Войну и мир». Okay, let's look at this painting, Последний кабак у заставы. Very depressing painting, right? The last tavern at the toll gate. Okay, so these are peasants, a husband and wife, who have come into town presumably to sell their stuff, right? And you see the empty wagons. And so they've earned some money, and now they're heading back home back home to the village. And where's the husband? Oh, well, he's in the tavern drinking away all the money they just earned while his wife is forced to wait outside. Okay, so again, very depressing. And we see a few bits of vocab to learn here to use. Kristyanka is a female peasant. Kabak, traktir, right, is a tavern. Zastava is a toll gate, which you would cross when entering a city. And now let's look at a few pairs here. Останавливаться, остановиться means to stop. Пропивать, пропить means literally to drink through one's money. Okay, then we get a motion verb. Remember how tricky those are with the 3 infinitives. Ездить, ехать, поехать. Okay, hopefully you remember a bit about how those work. If not, we'll review them soon. And then finally, we get a prefix motion verb, выходить, выйти, right, to come out on foot. Okay, so speaking of motion verbs, look at page 31. Here's a quick breakdown of, you could think of this as 3 major classes of aspectual pairs, right? We know that the vast majority of verbs simply come in aspectual pairs, right? 2 infinitives, like пропивать, пропить, right? There's our new verb we've just learned, to drink through. Okay, the big exception there are verbs of motion, right? Remember, what makes them so difficult is they come in sets of 3 infinitives, right? 2 imperfectives and 1 perfective, right? So we have an indeterminate imperfective and a determinate imperfective. If we wanted to review those very quickly, we could just remember the keywords, right? Ездить means to go around by vehicle or to make round trips by vehicle. Ехать, the determinate, means to be underway by vehicle. And finally, поехать, the perfective, means to set out by vehicle. And then if you remember, we normally assume that if someone sets off on a one-way trip, they'll complete, or they have completed the one-way trip. But again, all that поехать really tells us is that someone's setting off on a journey. And again, that's actually a good example of a of a perfective of inception, right? It's not a completed journey. It's really the beginning of the journey. But we could think of that as sort of an instantaneous thing. Someone is sitting around and bam, off they go on a journey. Okay, finally, if we prefix verbs of motion, we're back to the aspectual pair pattern, right? Again, the almost universal pattern of verbs coming in aspectual pairs, like выходить, выйти. Okay, so let's look at, keep that in mind, right? And pay attention to what type of verb we're dealing with, watching out for the motion verbs. Okay, let's just read these sentences and just give the aspect of the verb, right? Okay, again, there's not really a trick to this beyond knowing the pairs, right? So here we've just been given the pairs for these verbs, or most of them at least, the verbs we don't, the new ones. So that's really all we're dealing with, right? Learning the pairs or referring to them as needed and determining what aspect we have here, right, in the verb form we're looking at. Okay, number one. Бедная крестьянка и ее муж редко ездят в город. Okay, that's imperfective. That's one of those motion verbs. The poor peasant woman and her husband rarely make round trips by vehicle to the city, right? Remember how we unpack those verbs, right? Okay, so that's a regularly occurring trip. So that's, repetition, that's imperfective. Зимой очень холодно в русской провинции. In the winter, it's very cold in the Russian provinces. Yeah, we can see looking at the painting. Number two, они уже ехали домой, а муж вдруг остановился у кабака. Okay, so they were already underway by vehicle homeward, right? They were on their way home by vehicle when suddenly the husband stopped at the kabak, at the tavern. Okay, so we have two verbs here. First one is imperfective, right? That's very important. They were on their way home, right? They were traveling home when suddenly, and now we get an interrupted, or we have that background action interrupted by a perfective, a one-time action. Suddenly, the guy stops at the tavern, and we know we're in trouble when that happens. Okay, three. Он и раньше всегда останавливался у кабака. Okay, now we're talking about his habit, right? And before, right, earlier, he would always stop at this tavern. Okay, that's a repeated action, so imperfective. Вот и сегодня остановился. Now the one-time action today too, he stopped. Perfective. Number four. Муж пообещал жене, что просто водку попьет и скоро опять выйдет. Okay, here we have a little perfective sequence, right? One-time perfective sequence. The husband promised his wife that he will simply drink a bit of vodka, right? He'll drink for a bit. Papit, that's perfective, to do something for a bit. And will soon again walk out, right? He'll drink a bit and then he'll come out again and they'll go home. So perfective. Number five, крестьянка ждет, а муж все пьет в кабаке. Okay, the woman is waiting and her husband keeps drinking in the tavern, right? He's not coming out. Она уже не знает, будет ли он выходить вообще. Okay, so at this point she has no idea whether he'll come out at all. Okay, file this away for lesson, I believe, 109 when we get to advanced aspect. This word вообще is going to be our starting point, sort of our springboard into our discussion of advanced aspect. Basically, вообще means generally speaking or at all. And whenever we can use a вообще, we're going to get an imperfective verb, right? So she has no idea whether he'll come out at all, right? He could drink himself to death for all we know, right? And right, so there are no signs of his emerging. Okay, so anyway, imperfective. That's an imperfective, and we'll understand better why that is here in a couple of lessons. But again, the trick here, we don't really need any discussion per se, right? We should simply know that выходить is an imperfective verb, period. Right, so anyway. Number six. Да, он выйдет, и они поедут. Но сначала он пропьет все их деньги. Okay, looks like perfectives, right? First, a prefixed verb of motion. Yes, he'll come out and they'll set off by vehicle, right? Another little sequence. But first, he'll drink all their money. Okay, he'll successfully drink through all their money. Okay, so again, we see that form пропьет. Let's imagine we have no idea what that is. Well, we'd have to look it up in a dictionary. We'd see hopefully the pair пропивать, пропить, and we'd simply know, yes, indeed, пропьет is perfective by definition. And again, its meaning depends in part on its aspect, right? Number 7, крестьянка сидит и мерзнет. The woman is sitting and freezing, right? That's present tense, that's imperfective. Она уже почти совсем замерзла. She's already almost completely frozen. Okay, perfective, right? So she is in the process of freezing, and indeed, she's almost completely frozen already. Что за жизнь? What a life, what a life. Okay, next topic in terms of reviewing aspect, the basics of aspect is, what is the correspondence between Russian aspect and English tense? Well, the short answer is there is none, right? Because these are different categories. So you often hear people saying rather vaguely that, for example, perfect tense is equivalent to English perfect aspect. I've heard that before, right? Well, that's simply not true at all, really. There is no one-to-one correspondence between choice of aspect in Russian and the equivalent choice of tense in English if we were translating from Russian to English, for example. So remember, the first thing to say about tense, I think we've mentioned already in our review, we certainly did last year, is that English has many, many tenses, right? Russian has only 3 basic tenses, right? Present, past, future. But English has, for example, simple tenses like simple present, simple past, simple future. I work, I worked, I will work. It's got continuous tenses. I am working, I was working, I will be working. It also has perfect tenses, right? I have worked, I had worked, I will have worked. I have been working, I had been working. So the list goes on and on with English, right? And fortunately, assuming everyone listening has a good grasp of English tenses, that really isn't usually much of an issue, as long as we're aware, moving from Russian to English, that we have a wide availability of tenses at our disposal. And again, if you know English well, it's usually not too tricky based on context to choose the right English tense for translating. Okay, so just keep in mind that there is no one-to-one correspondence really whatsoever. It really all depends on context. Okay, so keeping that in mind, we can make 2 or 3 very simple points that are actually quite useful, both in terms of, again, translating Russian and maybe more importantly for us, really understanding what Russian aspect is communicating. The first point is extremely simple, right? If in Russian we're using present tense, right? Any action that's ongoing in the present tense, we have no choice whatsoever. We have to use the imperfective, right? So I am working, I work, I do work, right? Anything like that. Or even I have been working, right? Which is still ongoing. I have been working for 2 hours and I'm still working. Anything that's still ongoing in the present, we have no choice in Russian but to use imperfective, right? So to take a simple example, она читает «Войну и мир». We could translate that as she is reading, she reads, she has been reading, she does read, right? So there's a good example of, a choice of Russian aspect that's extremely simple, right? Present tense means imperfective. But then when we go to translate that, the context would really dictate which of these various English present tense forms we would use to translate. Okay, the next one is a bit not quite as simple, but also very, very useful and fairly straightforward, right? English continuous tenses, sometimes they're called progressive tenses, often correspond very nicely to Russian imperfectives. So, for example, if we ask the question, что она делала? Okay, so that's imperfective in Russian. So the emphasis really isn't on what she got done or what she did, but what she was doing, right? We're asking about how she was spending her time. And then the answer, for example, она читала Толстого. Okay, so look at how nicely, and really here, again, it could depend potentially on context, but just a very basic situation where we ask what she was doing. You see how nicely the English continuous tense corresponds to that. It really captures the sense of the Russian imperfective very nicely. What was she doing? Well, she was sitting around reading Tolstoy. And no mention of what she got done, how much she got read. Okay, future tense example. Она будет читать Толстого весь день. She'll be reading Tolstoy all day. Right? That future continuous she will be reading tells us what she will be doing for an extended period, tomorrow or whatever. Now, keep in mind that imperfective verbs can also express repetition. And so if we had, for example, repetition in the past, we would often translate that in English using would, right? Она читала Толстого каждый день. Now note the каждый день, that's kind of a red flag showing us that we definitely mean repetition. This is a repeated action. And that sort of prompts us to transition from simply she was reading Tolstoy to she would read Tolstoy, right? That repetition in the past, right? She would read Tolstoy every day. And of course, there are other ways to do this in English. She used to read Tolstoy every day, right? Used to do something is another way to capture that repetition. Okay, third item. This is also a really useful one. English simple tenses often correspond to perfective usage in Russian, perfective aspect in Russian. So just very simple everyday situations. I did this, I did that, or future tense, I'll do this, I'll do that, I'll read a book, I'll write a paper, I'll clean the apartment, right? This idea of just simply going and doing something. There's no emphasis at all on a long attempt or a long ongoing process, just simply going and doing something. Okay, so look at some examples. Она написала письмо. That would translate very nicely to she wrote a letter. Now, certainly it wouldn't be translated as she was writing a letter, right? You see how that is really very different from perfective. Она написала письмо. She wrote a letter. Now, again, if we were really emphasizing the accomplishment, we would say something like she got the letter written, right? There are other ways in English to really nail that point, to get that point across. But often just in sort of neutral expressions, a simple tense in English will work very nicely. Она открыла дверь. She opened the door. Now shifting to future, right? Simple future tense in English, and corresponding to that a perfective verb in Russian, which is simply conjugated and is automatically future tense. Она напишет письмо. Она откроет дверь. Okay, now what about perfect tenses in English? Does that have anything to do really with perfective aspect? Well, so we've already said that actually no, right? There is no one-to-one correspondence. So let's just look at a few examples and see where we might use perfect tense in English. For example, она прочитала «Войну и мир». Okay, so if we use a perfective, we could say she has read War and Peace completely, right? But if we simply say она читала «Войну и мир», that would also correspond to she has read War and Peace in the sense of вообще, meaning at all, period. Okay, there we're already getting into advanced aspects. We're going to return to this issue, I think in the next chapter actually, but in any case very soon. But this very simple example shows us how there really is no one-to-one correspondence, right? Here we could translate either the perfective or the imperfective using a perfect tense, right? She has read War and Peace, or she had read War and Peace, right? Again, the issue is, has she read it completely? Are we emphasizing the completion, or are we simply making kind of a bare statement that yes, she has at some point read War and Peace with no mention of completion? Okay, here's another example. Она прочитает «Войну и мир» к понедельнику. Students sometimes ask, well, since Russian has no perfect tenses, it has no future perfect, how do you express perfect tense? Well, again, you could use a perfective verb, but not necessarily. So we're going to have to return to this issue. It's a rather tricky one. But anyway, if you say «Она прочитает «Войну и мир» к понедельнику», a perfective verb, that's really saying that by Monday she will have completely read War and Peace. Okay, so there's an example of how a conjugated perfective can correspond to a future perfect, right? She will have read War and Peace by Monday. Or you could, again, just simply say she will read War and Peace by Monday, right? So again, it's really up to you if you were translating, do you choose simple future or future perfect? Когда ей было 7 лет, она уже читала Толстого. When she was 7 years old, she had already read Tolstoy. Okay, what aspect is that? Again, you see in English, we're getting she had read, we're getting a perfective, a perfect tense, but the Russian, again, is imperfective because all we're stating is the bare fact that at some point before turning 7, she had read Tolstoy, вообще, right? Just generally speaking. No mention of whether she even finished a single book by Tolstoy. Okay, now contrast that to the next example. All we're doing is changing the aspect. Когда ей было 7 лет, она уже прочитала роман. When she was 7, she had already read a novel completely. Right there, we're emphasizing the completion of the act. And again, note how there's no change in English tense there. So we've seen a couple of examples here in just this kind of brief survey of how there is no one-to-one correspondence between what aspect we're using in Russian and whether or not we're using a perfect tense. Okay, so this issue of tense and translation is a rather, you could go on all day about it, and if this were a translation course, we could probably spend a couple of weeks on this topic. The main point I really want to make is there are, again, 2 or 3 rules we've just seen here that are kind of nice rules of thumb. They help us understand the meaning of Russian aspect, but ultimately the main point may really be that there is no direct correspondence between aspect and tense. Remember, those are different categories, right? Even within Russian, right? Tense is one thing. You've got present, past, future. Aspect is something completely different, right? It's a different category. Okay, let's look at a few examples and think how might we translate this. First of all, what aspect are we looking at and how might we translate it into English? Number 1. Когда я была маленькой, я каждый день выносила мусор. Okay, выносить, вынести is the pair, that's imperfective. Now remember, with spotting these aspects, it's no guessing game, right? If you don't know the only way to know what aspect it is really is to know the pair. So you'd have to look up the pair in the back of the book if you don't remember it. Right now, of course, if you're blanking on the pair, then you could look for contextual clues, right? We'll talk about that more in a moment. Here, the red flag, as we call it, is каждый день, right? Every day, repetition, that's going to have to be imperfective. So выносила is imperfective. Translation, when I was little, every day I would carry out the trash. I would take out the trash. Or I used to take out the trash every day when I was little. Okay, so there's a nice way to capture that past tense repetition in English. Number 2, я опять потерял очки. Где же они теперь? Okay, потерял, that's perfective. Okay, you've lost your glasses, they're gone, the result is still in place, right? You've lost your glasses, completion. Okay, we could say, I've lost my glasses again, right? I've lost my glasses. Where are they now, right? Okay, now could we say I lost my glasses? Yeah, we could, right? There's nothing really wrong with that. Again, we may, it might depend on the temporal context, right? All we have here is just a kind of an isolated sentence, right? Think if we said something like last year, I lost my glasses again, right? The action is no longer in effect, right? So we would switch from the perfect tense in English, the present perfect I have lost, to simple past I have lost, or I had lost, right? I had lost my glasses again, right? Let's take an example. I woke up this time last year and realized I had lost my glasses again, right? So it's kind of a dumb example, but again, you see how the context can dictate our choice of tense in English. Number 3, я опоздал на вечеринку. I was late to the party. Когда я пришел, весь торт уже съели. Okay, when I arrived. Now note we have a main clause there, when I arrived, or an initial clause that's giving us a past tense context, right? When I arrived at the party, past tense, something had already happened. Okay, so here the Russian perfect aspect is helping us choose a past perfect We could say they had already eaten the whole cake. They'd eaten the entire cake when I arrived late at the party. Okay, so there's an example of past perfect. They had already eaten the cake. Number 4. Где же вы были? Мы вас ждем уже целый час. Where were you? Okay, let's translate this literally and see if it sounds right. It's obviously a present tense verb, right? Ждать, it's imperfective, present tense. Мы вас ждем уже целый час. We wait for you already a whole hour. Or we are waiting for you already a whole hour. Okay, that's the kind of thing you might hear from someone who's learning English, right? This type of tense mistake from Russians, for example, who are learning English. Okay, in English, there's really only one thing we'd say here. We have been waiting. We've been waiting on you for an entire hour, right? And here the person's just shown up and we tell them, where have you been? We've been waiting, right? Present perfect. Okay, so again, that's maybe a good example of something that is actually kind of a slippery, it's a rather complicated issue, but I think for most people who know English well, that really is not, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? Again, you just have to think of the context and think, what would you say as an English speaker in this context? You would not say, we are waiting for you a whole hour, right? No one would say that. Okay, number 5. После ужина я помою посуду. Делать мне больше нечего. Okay, after dinner, okay, we have perfect aspect in Russian, therefore future tense. I'll wash the dishes, right? There's an example of just simple future, right? How simple tenses in English can often correspond very nicely, very simply to perfective verbs in Russian. I'll wash the dishes. I've got nothing else to do. Делать мне больше нечего. Number 6. Я уже постирал. Вот твое чистое белье. Okay, so here is another perfective. We could say, again, sticking with which is simple past, I did the laundry. I did the laundry. Here's your clean laundry. Okay, nothing wrong with that in English, but again, based on context, it may sound even better to say, well, I've done the laundry. I've finished the laundry. Here's your clean laundry. Here are your clean clothes. Right, so there again, it's kind of really up to you. Either one would sound fine. I did the laundry, or I've done the laundry. To me, the second one would probably be more likely, absent any further context. Okay, number 7. Что мы делали? Гуляли в зоопарке и смотрели животных. Okay, sounds like we're parroting someone's question, right? Someone asks, what did you do? And you say, что мы делали? You're asking what we did. Okay, now what is the aspect in Russian? Imperfective. So this person is not asking, what did you get done? What did you accomplish? But simply, how were you spending your time? And to answer that question, we use imperfective verbs, right? Мы гуляли в зоопарке и смотрели животных. Okay, so we said that, to express this kind of thing, often a continuous tense in English can sound good. We were strolling in the zoo and looking at the animals. Okay, so that sounds okay. Again, based on context, based on your choice, you could say other things, right? What did you do today? Right? The question would have that emphatic tense, what did you do? And you could answer that simply in English with a simple past, right? Well, we strolled in the park and looked at the animals. So again, another example of how this is a kind of a big topic, right? There really is no one-to-one. There's no right answer, so to speak. Just kind of general things to consider. But again, even when you wouldn't use a continuous tense to translate, if you were doing kind of a real translation into natural English, it can still often be really useful to really grasp what the imperfective verb is saying in Russian literally, right? We were strolling in the park and we were looking at the animals. We were watching the animals. That really captures this action that was ongoing in the past. Okay, number 8. Ты уже сделала все свои домашние задания. Okay, perfect tense. Уже is kind of another little clue here. We'd probably say, have you done all of your homework, right? Have you done all of your home assignments, literally, right? So there's, again, a good example of how a perfective verb can correspond to a perfect tense in English, but again, not necessarily. Okay, one quick thing to review that's quite easy. What if we use multiple verbs in a sentence? Well, if we have two aspects and we use two or more verbs in a sentence, there are three possible combinations: multiple imperfectives, multiple perfectives, and combining the two, right? Combining an imperfective verb with at least one perfective verb. Okay, we discussed this last year. It's pretty simple, a pretty simple topic. Here are the three possibilities. Когда родители работали, дети играли. Okay, two imperfective verbs. Those are communicating overlapping, ongoing, right, extended actions. While the parents were working, here again we can translate that kind of more literally using using a continuous tense. The parents were working, and while they were in the process of working, the children were playing. Overlapping, extended actions. Okay, perfective verbs, multiple perfective verbs usually imply a sequence, right? First A, then B, then D, right? Where A has to be completed before B can take place, right? So, for example, мы открыли дверь и вошли в магазин. We opened the door, perfective, and walked into the store. Okay, and look how we're using those simple past forms in English. We opened, we walked into the store. Final combination, we have an imperfective verb kind of setting the backdrop, right? This extended ongoing action. And then against that backdrop, suddenly something happens, right? So for example, мы ужинали, когда она позвонила. We were having dinner, okay? Ongoing process. And now all of a sudden a perfective action comes in and interrupts that ongoing activity, right? She called, the phone rang, right? We were having dinner when the phone rang, when she called. Okay, let's look at a few examples and just again name the aspect and think a little bit how we might translate this, how we might make sense of the aspect in Russian. Он вошел в гостиную, включил телевизор и сел на диван. Okay, there are actually three verbs here, сел, which I didn't highlight, right? But three perfective verbs. These are all perfective. We have a sequence. He walked into the living room, he turned on the television, and he sat literally onto the sofa, right? A куда expression. Number two, он еще смотрел телевизор, когда я пришла домой с работы. Okay, смотреть, that's imperfective. He was watching the television. He was watching TV when I came home from work. Okay, there's the perfective. I came home from work. Пришла is perfective, interrupting his activity of watching the television. Number three, когда я убирала квартиру и стирала, он смотрел футбол по телевизору. Okay, overlapping imperfectives. While I was cleaning the apartment and doing the laundry, right, imperfectives, he, meanwhile, was watching soccer on TV, watching football on TV. Okay, so again, actually three verbs in this sentence. If we take all of them, they're all imperfectives. They're all overlapping, simultaneous, extended actions. Number four, я тут работаю, а он ничего не делает. Как ему не стыдно? I'm just realizing this forms a narrative. I wrote this and I forgot, right? It's like a little short story about a dysfunctional relationship. Okay, I'm working here. I'm sitting here working, we might say. I'm over here working. А он ничего не делает, and he's not doing anything. Как ему не стыдно, right? Literally, how not shameful for him, right? He ought to be ashamed of himself, right? How shameless he is. Right? Okay, now again, we have two imperfective verbs overlapping simultaneous actions. I'm over here working, meanwhile he's over there doing nothing. 5. Я скоро выключу телевизор и попрошу его помыть посуду. Soon I'll turn off the television and ask him to wash the dishes. Okay, that's another, both perfective verbs. That's a future sequence. First, I'll turn off the television, perfective. Now note that at that point the television is off, right? The screen is dark, right? We have the result. So first I'll turn off the television, and then sequence, I'll ask him once, perfective, to wash the dishes. Number 6. Он сказал, что может помогать мне и смотреть футбол одновременно. Okay, he said that he can help me and watch soccer simultaneously. Okay, that's a brilliant idea. Um, I wonder why he didn't suggest that earlier. Anyway, so помогать, смотреть, two imperfectives, again, overlapping simultaneous actions. Okay, let's now supply some Russian verb forms. We have a bit of vocabulary here for this painting, which is called Взятие снежного городка, the taking of the snow city. By the way, взятие is a verbal noun from the verb взять, you may remember from last year, meaning to take. So взятие is a taking, literally, right? The taking of the snow city. And this was an old kind of folk game. We're about to learn about it as we translate these sentences. A few more vocab items. Narod is the people, the folk, right? Sometimes it's also translated as nation. So the people, like the Russian people or the Russian nation, for example. Народный is popular, right? Or maybe national, or also folk, right? Like folk dancing or something. Строить, построить, разделяться, разделиться, защищать, защитить. Okay, there are three aspectual pairs we can use. And finally, снег, снежный, snowy, and снежок. That's actually a diminutive meaning a little snow or a little clump of snow, a snowball, снежок. Okay, so let's see if we can guess what aspect we would need and then see if we can produce the corresponding form. If you go to the Russian museum, right, that's the Русский музей в Петербурге, right, you'll see this painting. It's called The Taking of the Snow City. Okay, you will see this painting. If you go to the museum, you'll see the painting. Okay, sounds like a one-time, just simple, right now note again in the English, you will see, right? It's just a simple future tense verb. Okay, so what's the pair for seeing? Видеть, увидеть. Okay, that's a pair you really should know from last year. If you don't, you need to review your aspectual pairs. Okay, so we're going to work with увидеть, and all we need to do is conjugate that verb. Если вы пойдете в Русский музей, вы, okay, we're being polite, вы увидите эту картину. Она называется «Взятие снежного городка». Okay. Number two, we've already seen several paintings this semester on the theme of Maslenitsa. Okay, now here's one that might stump you. And again, we've said already that just because we have a perfect tense in English, by no means does that imply that we're going to get perfect aspect in Russian, right? There's no correspondence. Now, I think at first glance, a lot of students would probably guess perfective here. And we're going to talk more about why that is here very quickly when we get to advanced aspect, right? That's something that, it may actually be my fault. I may have misled you to think that a little bit. But the reason is that we had to simplify a little bit when we first introduced aspect, right? So very soon we're going to get the full picture of kind of the real meaning of our aspectual choice in Russian. So for now, let's just think about this. Do we have any clues here that would suggest that we don't need perfective, even though, by the way, why would most students guess perfective? Well, we've seen several paintings and they think, well, that's a completed action. And so that automatically means it's going to be perfective. That's actually not true in Russian. And you may have already realized that if you think carefully about it. But again, we're going to talk about this in a lot of detail very soon. Now, that aside for a moment, several paintings this semester. Okay, so a semester is kind of a rather long, extended period of time. We also mentioned several paintings, which implies the idea of repetition, sort of a habit extended across time. So, then on top of that, there's really no emphasis here on accomplishment, right? It's not something like, well, we've taken a look at 5 paintings, or this doesn't sound like good English, but we've gotten 5 paintings looked at. Anything like that. There's no implication of that here, right? So we're simply stating a bare fact. We have looked at paintings, and on top of that, this has been ongoing the entire semester. Okay, so for all of those reasons, imperfective would probably make more sense here. Мы уже видели несколько картин в этом семестре на тему масленица. Okay, now, by the way, would it be grammatically incorrect to use perfective here? No, it would not. But it would shift the emphasis. Okay, so again, more on that in a couple of lessons, right? Actually, let me check. Yeah, we've got one more lesson of review, and then we'll get to advanced aspect. And all your questions will be answered. Okay, number 3, the Taking of the Snow City is an old folk game that they used to play during Maslenitsa. Okay, look at that English tense, used to play, or we could say they would play this folk game during Maslenitsa. What is that getting across? Repetition in the past. Okay, that's a no-brainer in Russian. That's going to be imperfective aspect. We need a past tense form of an imperfective verb. Взятие снежного городка – это старая народная игра, в которую играли в Масленицу, right? Играть. We need imperfective. Okay, number 4. First, they would build a city out of the snow, and then they would be divided into 2 teams. Okay, again, we had this idea of repetition. When they would play this game back in the day, whenever Maslenitsa came around, well, first they would do this, then they would do that, then they would do something else. This is how the game worked. Okay, so again, we need imperfective. Сначала они строили городок из снега, потом, okay, we need to use imperfective up there, разделяться. Потом они разделялись на 2 команды. Right, first they'd build the city out of snow, and then they would split up into 2 teams. Now, by the way, if you used perfective here, that would imply that you're talking about a single occurrence. Right, first they built the city, then they split up into teams. Right, but again, because we're talking about repetition in the past, we need imperfective. Okay, finally, one team defended the city with sticks and snowballs, while the other tried to take the city on horseback. Okay, now we're still kind of same thing as in number 4, right? We'd say, well, one team would do this and the other team would do that. That already calls for imperfective. On top of that, here we have attempt, right? So this is the process of the game, right? One team is trying to do one thing, the other team is trying to do something else. They're in the process, in the ongoing attempt. So we have several reasons here to choose imperfective. Одна команда защищала город ветками и снежками, а другая старалась взять его на лошадях. Okay, actually, I misspoke a little bit. Look at the first half. That was exactly what I predicted, right? One team would defend the city with sticks and snowballs, while the other, okay, our main verb here, which I was overlooking, is starались, right? That's our imperfective verb. The other team would try. Okay, what would they try to do? Now, here's a little point on aspect I'm not sure we've reviewed this year, but we definitely mentioned it back in books 1 and 2. If you're trying to do something, then the to, right? I'm trying to blank. That to in Russian is very likely to be perfective, right? Because the whole point of trying is to get something accomplished, right? To do it completely. Right? So here we would say, другая команда старалась взять его на лошадях. Right? The other team would try to successfully, completely take the city on horseback, right? And that's why, by the way, look at the aspect of the verbal noun взятие, right? Up in the, right? You can see that the guy has successfully broken through and he has seized the city, right? It's a completed, successful action. By the way, if we go back, it's kind of a fun example. If we go back to the first half of the sentence, what if we use perfective here and said, одна команда защитила город ветками и снежками? Well, the game's over, right? Because if we use perfective there, well, one team successfully defended the city. Right now, it's over, right? Game over. Okay, so that would sort of cut short this entire sentence, and the second half already wouldn't make any sense at all. Okay, so some nice examples there. Okay, last thing very quickly today is, again, by way of review of aspect, red flags. Okay, so I'm not going to rehash this. This is something we spent a lot of time on last year. Look over the list of expressions. If you have any sort of adverb or adverbial phrase, anything that conveys repetition or duration, right? So something's being repeated or it's ongoing for a long period of time, an extended activity. We call those imperfective red flags, right? Because again, absent any sort of unusual context, they pretty clearly call for imperfective verbs, right? So that's a very safe rule of thumb. Again, we don't want to say anything categorical in Russian because it can get complicated. But if you see a phrase like всегда, I always do this, I would always do that, I will always do this, that's just crying out for an imperfective verb, right? Another phrase like, for example, целый год, for an entire year. Okay, that's a very long, extended period of time, right? Remember, the broader the context, the more likely you are to see imperfective verbs. If you have a very narrow, sort of one-time, very specific context, the chances are much greater you'll be talking about perfective verbs in Russian. More on that in a couple of days. Okay, so the first bit of vocabulary you see are imperfective red flags. They're very reliable. If you see any of these, you can bet you're going to see an imperfective verb. Now, the second batch of vocab are common examples of what we could call perfective red flags. And you see that a lot of them just sort of imply logically some kind of one-time, rather abrupt, completed action as opposed to something drawn out or repetitive. So things like suddenly, already, finally, right? So, for example, finally I got this thing done, right? They just kind of imply perfective. Now, maybe the most important thing here is to note that the perfective red flags are not nearly as reliable as imperfective. Why is that? Well, here's a very simple example. What if repetition is involved, right? So if you say something like, well, let's just stick with English. I was already reading the book. Okay, well, in Russian, right, I was reading, note the English tense, that's going to be imperfective, right? So an adverb like уже, already in Russian, can often call for the perfective, but again, we would have to look at the context, right? If the actual verb we're using is describing, again, extended or repeated action, then we can say that kind of imperfective idea trumps the red flag, right? The perfective red flag. Okay, so these perfective red flags are kind of useful. We have to always be on guard. We can't think of this as any kind of a rule, right? Now here, returning to something we mentioned just a moment ago, a lot of verbs will almost always call for perfective infinitives after them. For example, to forget to do something, to try to do something, to manage to get something done, right? Again, just sort of by the logic of their meaning, these verbs are almost always going to be followed by a perfective. Okay, very quickly, let's look at a few examples and just circle red flags. I'll do this very quickly to wrap this up. Родители всегда дарили мне носки на день рождения. My parents would always give me socks for my birthday. Okay, the key word is, the red flag is всегда, always, right? Imperfective, repetition. Number 2, нет больше водки. Мы всю бутылку уже выпили. There's no more vodka. We've already drunk up the whole bottle. Okay, here our perfective red flag is уже. But remember, that doesn't always necessarily imply perfective. For example, if we said мы уже пили водку, that would mean we were already drinking the vodka, right? We were already in the process of drinking the vodka. Number 3, меня вдруг разбудил телефонный звонок. I was suddenly woken up by a telephone call. Okay, that's perfective. Do we have any perfective red flags? Yeah, вдруг, right? Вдруг. Okay, that's a perfective red flag. Now, can we think of an example that would show us how this perfective red flag is not necessarily reliable? Sure. Every morning I would be awakened by a telephone call, right? So we introduce repetition. We keep the vdrug, right? This is happening suddenly every morning. But again, because of the every morning, the repetition, we have to have imperfective. Number 4, я опять забыл закрыть холодильник. Again, I forgot to close the fridge. Okay, here the red flag is sort of this verb забыть, right? It's not that I forgot to kind of attempt to close the fridge, or I forgot to be in the process of closing the fridge. That just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, right? It's perfective. Я забыл закрыть холодильник. Number 5. Я целую неделю работал над этим сочинением. I worked for a whole week literally above this composition. That's how we say I worked on something in Russian. Okay, imperfective verb, our red flag is целую неделю, right? For an entire week. Long extended time period. Number 6. Мы за семестр прочитали 6 романов. Okay, you may remember this from last year. That's a za plus accusative gives us a phrase like in English, in a semester or within a semester, right? In a semester, we got 6 novels read, right? We completely read 6 novels, right? So we're expressing an accomplishment, and we're telling not for how long something was going on, right? An extended time period, but rather within how much time we got something done, right? That's za plus accusative. So that's our red flag here, this za phrase. За семестр, meaning that's how we tell how much we got done in a semester. Okay, so quite a bit of stuff today. Again, hopefully it's reasonably familiar from last year. This is stuff we can consider to be basic aspectual awareness. Tomorrow we're going to review a bit about how aspectual pairs work and learn a bit more about how they're formed. And then on day 109, we'll finally get to advanced aspect, and that'll really begin the new content of this course here in Book 3. Okay, so until next time, до свидания.